If 3 weeks ago your squash and cucumber leaves went from healthy green to a dusty gray-white overnight, like somebody dragged a chalk eraser across every leaf in your garden, and within days the whole vine just folded in on itself, I want you to stay with me for the next several minutes, because what I'm about to hand you costs about $2 at any drugstore in the country, and it's the exact same thing a retired railroad signalman named Vernon Hartley used in Bremen, Kentucky, every Saturday morning for 36 years. My name is Eli Mercer, and for years I've been collecting the kind of garden knowledge that used to travel porch to porch before it got buried under glossy seed catalogs and $15 fungicide bottles. Music. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you a ratio that no seed packet will ever print. I'm going to tell you about a 1981 University of Tennessee bulletin that was quietly pulled from circulation. And I'm going to tell you why your county extension office has never once brought this up at a single garden club meeting. Stay with me until I tell you about a cardboard box marked Willow that a Pennsylvania graduate student kept hidden in a storage unit for 30 years. Because that box is the reason I believe any of this. One plain aspirin tablet, 1 gallon of water, a few drops of dish soap. That's the whole secret. And before you tell me your tomatoes are already half-eaten by blight or your squash is already coated in white, it's not too late. Whatever's struggling in your garden right now will respond within 10 days. This isn't about next season. This is about the plants already in your ground this Saturday. Music. Now let me tell you about Vernon. Vernon Hartley spent 38 years working a signal tower for a short-line railroad in western Kentucky. The kind of job where you sit alone in a little box on stilts for 10-hour shifts, watching for trains that sometimes don't come for hours. He had a high school education, a bad knee from a fall in 1971, and a garden that the whole town of Bremen talked about. Every Saturday morning, rain or shine, from the time his transplants took hold in May until the first hard frost, Vernon mixed 1 crushed aspirin tablet and a few drops of dish soap into a gallon of water, and he sprayed every leaf of every plant in his garden, top and bottom, until it dripped. He learned it from his Aunt Pearl, who raised him after his mother passed in 1948. Pearl had learned it during the worst years of the Depression from a neighbor, a Welsh stonemason named Idris Price, who'd come over from a village near Aberystwyth in the 1920s. Idris's family back in Wales had been boiling willow bark and pouring the bitter brown water over their cabbage rows for longer than anyone could remember, a practice with a documented history going back centuries. In 1763, a clergyman in Oxfordshire named Edward Stone wrote to the Royal Society describing how willow bark reduced fevers. The same compound that decades later chemists would isolate and call salicin. By the time Idris's grandmother was alive, willow bark water for sickly cabbages was just something everyone's grandmother did, the way everyone's grandmother had a cure for a cough. Idris didn't have willow trees in Kentucky, but he had a corner drugstore that sold aspirin tablets for a few cents a bottle, because by the 1920s, the patent on Bayer's aspirin had expired, and every pharmacy in the country carried its own cheap version. Idris worked out that crushing a tablet into a gallon of water and spraying it on his plants did roughly what the willow bark water had done back home, only faster and without the hours of boiling. He showed Pearl. Pearl showed Vernon. Vernon did it every single Saturday for 38 years. Music. So what is actually happening when that aspirin dissolves in the water? Aspirin is acetyl salicylic acid. Inside the plant, it behaves like a close cousin of a hormone that plants make naturally called salicylic acid, one of the main signals a plant's own immune system uses to recognize that an attack is underway. When a leaf is infected by a fungus or chewed by certain insects, the plant produces a small burst of salicylic acid, and that burst travels through the plant's vascular system and switches on a defensive state. Scientists call this systemic acquired resistance, or SAR. The plant starts producing what are called pathogenesis-related proteins, thickens the walls of its cells, and changes the chemistry of its leaves in ways that make it a much harder target for the next fungal spore or insect that comes along. Here's the part that should stop you for a second. In 1979, a researcher named Raymond White published a study showing that spraying tobacco plants with a dilute aspirin solution induced resistance to tobacco mosaic virus, one of the most destructive plant viruses there is. The study was real. It was published, and for the most part, it stayed inside academic plant pathology journals, discussed by specialists, and never made its way into a single seed catalog or extension office pamphlet aimed at home gardeners. Music. That's where the 1981 bulletin comes in. 2 years after White's paper, a soil and plant pathologist at the University of Tennessee Agricultural Experiment Station named Dr. Lucille Faraday ran a 2-year field trial on home garden scale plots of squash, cucumbers, and tomatoes. Half the plots got a bi-weekly foliar spray of dilute aspirin solution. The other half got nothing but standard fertilizer. According to the bulletin Faraday published in the fall of 1981, the treated plots showed a 58% reduction in powdery mildew coverage, a 64% reduction in early blight lesion counts on tomato foliage, and, almost as an aside near the end of the report, a 71% reduction in the establishment of new aphid colonies on treated plants, something Faraday admitted she hadn't expected and couldn't fully explain. The bulletin was printed in a run of a few hundred copies, distributed mostly to county agents. By 1984, it had quietly stopped appearing in the experiment station's annual bibliography. Faraday's later work, from the mid-1980s onward, was almost entirely focused on synthetic fungicide application timing, work that, according to her own grant records, was funded directly by 2 of the largest agricultural chemical manufacturers in the country. Music Faraday wasn't the only one. A nearly identical trial was run at Iowa State in 1982, another at Penn State in 1985, and the Penn State one is the one that stayed with me. It was the dissertation project of a graduate student named Daniel Pruitt, working under a plant pathologist named Dr. Miriam Castellano. Pruitt's study ran from 1985 to 1987, tracking 10 different vegetable crops across 30 test plots, comparing aspirin-sprayed plants against untreated controls. On powdery mildew-prone crops like squash, cucumber, and melon, Pruitt recorded an average of less than 1 mildew lesion per square foot of leaf on treated plants, compared with an average of 42 lesions per square foot on untreated plants. 42 to less than 1. That's not a rounding error, that's a different garden. Pruitt's dissertation was never published as a journal article. In the spring of 1987, he took a position with a fungicide manufacturer in Ohio. According to a short interview he gave to a regional farm magazine in 1996, he was told during onboarding that any further public discussion of his graduate research would not be looked on kindly by his new employer, and he spent the next 25 years developing synthetic fungicide formulations. He passed away in 2012. Years later, his daughter, Renee, was clearing out a storage unit in Harrisburg and found a single bound copy of his dissertation inside a cardboard box. On the side of the box, in his own handwriting, in heavy marker, was one word: willow. She donated it to the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society's archive, where it sits today for anyone who knows to ask for it. A man who spent 25 years building synthetic fungicides kept the one study that pointed the other way in a box and labeled it with the name of the tree that started the whole thing: music. Now, here's why none of this made it to your garden. There is no patent on acetylsalicylic acid. A bottle of 100 plain aspirin tablets costs about $2, and at 1 tablet per gallon every other week, will treat an average backyard garden for an entire season with tablets left over. There's no brand to build a marketing campaign around, no exclusive formula, no sales rep whose bonus depends on you buying it again next month. Compare that to the fungicide aisle, where products are patent protected, heavily marketed, and priced to be repurchased every few weeks all season long. Extension offices aren't lying to you. Most of the agents I've spoken with are decent, knowledgeable people, but the land-grant university system that trains them and funds their research was built in the 1860s to serve large-scale commercial agriculture, and the research dollars that flow through it overwhelmingly come from the same companies that sell synthetic fungicides and pesticides. A $2 bottle of aspirin that works does not generate research grants, conference presentations, or repeat customers, so it falls through the cracks. Not because anyone is hiding it in some dramatic sense, but because nobody has a reason to pick it back up. Music, let me tell you about a Saturday in July of 1991. Vernon's neighbor, a man named Curtis Boone, had a squash patch that turned white with powdery mildew almost overnight. The way it does, seemingly fine on Tuesday, coated by Friday. Curtis stood at the fence and asked Vernon what on earth he sprayed, because Vernon's squash, 20 feet away, was untouched. Vernon told him the truth: 1 aspirin, 1 gallon of water, a few drops of dish soap, every other Saturday since May. Curtis laughed, told Vernon he ought to write for one of those tabloids at the grocery store checkout, and went and bought a bottle of fungicide instead. Vernon just shrugged and went back to his hose. That September, Vernon's squash plants were still producing so heavily that Pearl's old recipe for squash bread got passed around 3 different church potlucks. Music. So here's the protocol, and the details matter. The ratio is 1 plain, uncoated aspirin tablet, the standard 325 milligram kind, sometimes labeled 5 grains, crushed into powder, dissolved first in a cup of warm water, then added to a full gallon of water, along with about a 1/4 teaspoon of mild dish soap or a small amount of horticultural oil. The soap isn't optional. Without it, the solution beads up and rolls right off a waxy leaf without ever being absorbed. Unlike a soil drench, this goes on the leaves, both the tops and the undersides, since the undersides are where most fungal spores land and where most of the leaf's pores, the stomata, are concentrated. Spray until the leaves are visibly wet but not dripping in sheets. Do this in the early morning or the early evening, never in the middle of a sunny day, because a wet leaf in direct sun can scorch. Timing across the season matters as much as the ratio. Do not spray seedlings in their first 2 to 3 weeks after transplant. Young transplants are dealing with enough stress from the move itself, and triggering a defensive response on top of transplant shock can slow them down rather than help. Wait until the plant has put out new growth and looks settled, usually 2 to 3 weeks after transplanting, then begin. From there, spray every 2 weeks, not every week. This isn't a fertilizer, and more frequent applications don't produce a stronger effect. They just waste tablets. Vernon did his every other Saturday, which is where the rhythm comes from, and which is easy to remember if you tie it to a day you're already in the garden anyway. For fruiting vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, squash, cucumbers, melons, continue every 2 weeks through the season. For leafy greens, you're harvesting continuously, like lettuce or spinach. It's worth easing off about 2 weeks before a big harvest, simply so you're not spraying anything onto leaves you're about to eat raw that same week, even though the amount involved is tiny. For roses and other ornamentals plagued by black spot or powdery mildew, you can go slightly stronger, 2 tablets per gallon, since you're not eating them. Stop applications about 3 to 4 weeks before your first expected frost, for the same reason you'd stop any foliar program. There's no benefit to triggering a defensive response in a plant that's about to go dormant anyway. 1 aspirin, 1 gallon, 1 Saturday, or whatever day you pick as long as you keep it. Every protocol I've gathered like this one, every old recipe, every buried bulletin, every technique from this channel, is collected together in what I call the Willow Ledger, linked in the description below. Music. Now stay with me, because this is the part I built this whole video around. Within about 10 days of your first spray, you'll notice the new growth coming in slightly tougher, the leaves a touch thicker, almost leathery compared to the soft, floppy growth that powdery mildew and aphids love. That's not your imagination. That's the plant's cell walls responding to the signal. By the 3rd application, you'll start to see fewer new mildew spots appearing on new leaves, even if older leaves that were already infected before you started don't fully recover. They won't, and that's normal. The plant isn't curing existing infections. It's making itself a harder target for new ones. Aphid colonies that would normally explode across the underside of your squash leaves within a week stay small enough to knock off with a blast from the hose. Early blight on tomatoes, instead of climbing the plant from the bottom up week after week, tends to stall out on the lower leaves where it started. None of this means pest and disease free. Nothing is. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But the difference between spraying synthetic fungicide every 10 days all summer and spraying $2 worth of aspirin every other week is, for most home gardens, the difference between a part-time job and a Saturday morning habit. Music. I want to be fair here, because there are honest questions, and they deserve honest answers. The first is whether aspirin will harm bees, ladybugs, or other beneficial insects. At this dilution, 1 tablet per gallon, applied to foliage every 2 weeks, There's no mechanism by which it would. It isn't a contact poison. It doesn't kill anything on contact the way an insecticide does. It changes the plant's internal chemistry, and beneficial insects that land on a leaf afterward aren't exposed to anything that would harm them. The second is whether salicylic acid builds up in the soil over time the way some salts can, because this is a foliar spray rather than a soil drench. And because salicylic acid is broken down fairly quickly by soil microbes and sunlight, accumulation isn't something home gardeners using this every 2 weeks need to plan around. The third, and the most common one I hear, is where are the recent peer-reviewed studies? The honest answer is that systemic acquired resistance itself is extremely well established in plant science. It's studied constantly in research labs. What's missing isn't the underlying science. It's field-scale studies on home garden crops, for the same reason Faraday's and Pruitt's work never got picked back up. Nobody funds research with no product to sell at the end of it. And the fourth is the fair one. Maybe this just makes for a generally healthier plant, and a healthier plant resists everything better, full stop. There's truth in that. But SAR is a specific pathway, not just general vigor. It's the difference between a plant that's well-fed and a plant whose immune system has been put on alert. A well-fed plant with no SAR response can still get hammered by the first mildew spore that lands on it in July. A plant whose defenses are primed meets that spore differently. Vernon passed away in 2018 at 84. His eighth of an acre in Bremen had become something of a local fixture. Neighbors driving by slow just to look at it. The year before he died, his garden produced enough squash, cucumbers, and tomatoes that his daughter Joellen was driving coolers of vegetables to 2 different churches every week from June through September, on top of what the family ate and put up themselves. After Vernon died, Joellen kept the garden going, following his Saturday routine exactly as she'd watched him do it as a kid. She told me that the first season she ran it herself, without quite believing it would work without him, her squash plants. Same variety, same spot, same soil. Outlasted every other squash patch on her road by nearly 6 weeks before mildew finally caught up with them. Her neighbors started asking what she sprayed. She tells them the truth. 1 aspirin, 1 gallon, a little dish soap, every other Saturday. Most of them laugh, the way Curtis laughed at Vernon 30 years earlier. But a few have tried it, and those few came back the next season and told her it worked exactly the way she said. 1 aspirin, 1 gallon, a few drops of dish soap, every other Saturday. That's what Idris brought from a Welsh hillside. That's what Pearl taught Vernon during the worst years anyone in Bremen could remember. That's what Vernon taught Joellen on Saturday mornings for almost 40 years, and that's what I'm telling you now. Do it this Saturday on whatever's already struggling in your garden. Then tell me in the comments what's been hitting your garden this year. Mildew, blight, aphids, something else. Because I read every one of them, and your stories are how I find the next thing worth digging up. And if this gave you back something that should never have been buried in the first place, subscribe, because there's a whole community here recovering the knowledge our grandparents had and our parents lost. Next time, I'm heading to a hollow in eastern Kentucky to show you how one family has kept their seed corn pest-free in a tin-lined cabinet for over 70 years, using nothing but cedar shavings and 1 spice you already have in your kitchen. But for now, go find that $2 bottle of aspirin, 1 tablet, 1 gallon, a little dish soap, this Saturday, and watch what your garden does by August.